The topic is a self-actualization, a journey within the human soul. And to start with a disclaimer, don't expect that I'm taking you on a journey. But I at least can point to the direction, and the rest of it will be up to you, because such journeys have to be individual journeys. As in all spiritual practices, it's not something you can teach or preach or even recommend. It's God who guides, and it's your duty to follow through. So to get right to the point, following the discussion we had last week, it had to do with the nafs and ruh. We'll start with the distinction in the application of the term, both as an expression and as an Arabic vocabulary, Quranic vocabulary at that, and as a terminology of Islamic mysticism or tasawwuf or irfan, whichever term you're familiar with. We have the term ruh as spirit, we have the term ruh as nafkha, and we have the term ruh as ammara. So, the understanding primarily is that my understanding, which is 100% only according to me, and the rest of you can make your own decisions. That ruh comes from God, ruh is of God, ruh is God. Only when it disperses, when it comes down to us, when it is embodied in the human form and in other living forms, then that ruh is owned, it's personalized. And in that case we use the Arabic word nafs, which means both the self, and it also means the owned. So the same word has two meanings. And the importance of the word nafs in that sense is that when the ruh becomes part of the human inner core, the inner being, when it is owned, then the sense of accountability and responsibility goes along with it. Ruh has no accountability. Ruh as spirit has no accountability, but nafs has accountability, because you have owned it and you act upon it, and you use it in terms of either positive propensities or negative propensities. And in a way to link it up with the lecture that Mr. Wasik just gave you. So to me, Satan or Shaitan is not a person. It should not be personified. It is not a being. Rather, it is a negative propensity within each one of us. Because remember, we were given the free will. In the free will, you can do well, you can do good, as well as you can do bad. Without one or the other, you would not have a choice. So the only way you can have a choice is to have the freedom to do good or evil. And it is when you do evil based on your negative propensity is when we call it shaitan. But a lot of people are used to this concept of personifying everything, including shaitan, as if it were a person. Shaitan is not a person. It is the negativity within you. So, so the ruh within you becomes the nafs. Then you're accountable, and you can do either good or bad. So that is one part. And while the nafs is within you, you're responsible. But at the end, the nafs leaves. And it goes back where? Back to where it had come from. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajiun. We come from him and we go back to him. So if you can imagine this beautiful slide, the invisible one, that if there's a circle and the divine is at the top, when the ruh comes down, It is still part of the divine. Once it enters a body, once it enters a form, the form is the enabler of it, then it becomes a nafs. Because it's our actions, our limbs, hands, feet, whatever we do, our speech, that can be either negative or positive. And that is run by a special energy. That is the energy that comes from up there. So that is where I would define ruh as the nafs part. The second part is the nafkha, which simply means to breathe in, to bring something to life, as it is in respect to the creation of Adam, that God breathed in his spirit into the body of Adam. So again, ruh is mentioned separate, but nafkha is the action. So if we talk about that, we can think about ruh as that which enlivens us, that which brings us to life. And here I'm not making any I'm not imposing any moralistic values on it being good or bad. It just brings us to life. The next critical part is ruh in respect to the ayah which says, which uses the verb amara. And this is perhaps the most significant of the distinctions we need to make. God is the creator, the khaliq. The verb there will be khalaqa. God creates. When we use the word khalaqa, it means God creates and gives that entity the freedom to do whatever he, she, it wants to do. And in that sense, we humans also become khaliq. We create something else. So we become the khaliq of our own creation. So there could be khalqat bil wasita or bil la wasita, with by means or without any means. So when the verb khalaqa is used in the Quran, it is used in reference to a thing created, an entity brought into existence, into form in many cases, and given the right and the ability and the faculties so that it can act upon things. In other words, in khalaqa, the creation is independent. We do have independence. If we did not have independence, God could not, logically speaking, God could not hold us accountable for anything. However, the verb amara is different. It's sometimes translated as command, that especially in reference to the ayah قُلْ رُوحٌ مِّنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي, that the spirit is of the command of God. I slightly differ here, is that yes, amara does mean command, but it also means a creation. Now this creation of amara is different than the creation of khalaqa. In the case of khalaqa, an entity is created and given its independence. Whereas in the case of amara, a thing created is given energy. But the source of energy is still connected. So in terms of our spirit, we are connected to God. To give you an example of, I did complain about the light, right? Okay, one more time. There's not enough light here. So if we use the allegory of light, the light bulb is created. It's independent. You can unplug it, you can put one light bulb in another place, and all that. It has the ability to absorb different wattages of electricity and all that. But the light bulb is not the light. The light is the electric current that goes through it. And so the current, the very term current means running continuously. If it's running from point A to point B, that means it has to be connected. But the light bulb is independent. So ruh in that sense is the current that runs through us, that energizes us. And so therefore, ruh is not created. Another distinction, to take it a little bit on the grammatical side, for Surya's case at least, is that nafs, when it is owned in a body, contained in a body, since body is in the, what we call in tasawwuf, alam kasra, or the realm of multiplicity, where things and entities have physical forms. Obviously, forms have plurals and singulars. So you can have nafs both as singular or as plural. Anfus, for instance. But ruh does not have plural. Yes, people use it, like the term arwah, but that is creating an Arabic language, a grammatical construct, which they subconsciously impose on the Quran. Quran does not talk about ruh in plural. Why? Because, like I argued, if it comes from one God, there is one God, there is one ruh, it cannot be plural, since it's always connected. You make the ruh plural, you have to connect it to another God, and that takes us back to the issue of shirk. So ruh should always be used, at least in the context of Quranic language, as singular. There is only one. It energizes, like the electric current. The effects could be different. When you plug in a light bulb to an electricity, to a current, it gives you light. Stove, it gives you heat. Refrigerator, it keeps things cold. The effects could be different, but it's the same current. So it's the same thing with the ruh. It empowers us, but once we are empowered, depending on whether we have more positive propensities, which is my interpretation of the divine, of God, or negative propensities, which is that of shaitan. You could use either one of them, and you could go in any one of those directions. Now, to go back to the ayah, قُلْ رُوحٌ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي, that I objected to the first interpretation that it is the command of God. Then I give you the interpretation that it is the continuously created but always connected source with the divine. However, if you go to the Quran, this ayah has not been revealed in isolation, obviously. So if you look at the context is different. The context is talking about, this of course is from the Surah Isra, the ascension of the Prophet, which was the most implausible, unimaginable, unperceptive event in the human history. Forget about Islam. Is for someone to come and, my interpretation of Isra is that it breaks the dimensions of time and space. We have known, and we do know, the world to have dimensions of time and space. That's the only thing we can operate with. And the time and space dimension cannot be altered, except in reference to Isra, where the Prophet leaves Mecca, goes to Jerusalem, then he ascends to heaven, and then he comes down, and then he goes back to Mecca, and the whole thing has happened in how long a time? Fractions of a second, because the ring on the door was still swinging. And of course, since this was difficult for people to perceive the cracking and the merging of the dimensions of time, since our sciences were not that advanced, a lot of people denied the Prophet's prophecy. They say, well, now he has gone too far. So it's in that respect when this ayah has been revealed. And I will, for the interest of time, I will just recite the English translation, the verse before and the verse after, and then you pay attention to where the word ruh comes and in what context. Say, everyone acts in a manner peculiar to himself, and your sustainer is fully aware as to who has chosen the best path, in respect to Isra. and they will ask thee about the nature of divine inspiration. Divine inspiration, I repeat. Say, this inspiration comes at my sustainer''s behest, and you cannot understand its nature, O men, since you have been granted very little of real knowledge. And the subsequent verses, and if we so willed, we could indeed take away whatever we have revealed unto thee, and in that state of need, thou wouldst find none to plead thy behalf before us. My understanding of this is that this ruh is talking about not the ruh that runs in the human body as nafs, as we talked about it before, but rather the spirit of the totality of existence. We believe in God to be omnipresent, to be everywhere, right? So if God is everywhere, God is empowering everything. And that empowerment is called the ruh, the spirit of existence. It's talking about that totality. It's not about the ruh in you or in me. It's about the totality. So it's in that respect when it says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلْ رُوحٌ مِّنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. That it explains it, and then it tells us that don't even bother to understand it, because humans have not been given the capacity to understand it. It's only our arrogance that we think that we know and that we can understand things. That is the greatest arrogance that I can observe. We are not capable of understanding things. Why? Because we understand things only on the basis of our senses. And at that, only our outer senses, the sense of touch, smell, and all that, that not only are they limited in their full capacity as we use them, like our sense of smell is not even the best. You know, cats and dogs can smell better than us. Eagles can see better than us. Whales can hear better than us. So even in that sense, our senses are not perfect. But then even if we add the technological enhancements, the periscopes and telescopes and microscopes and all the other scopes you can imagine, okay? Even with those, they have limitations. That the biggest telescopes can have, they do have a range. The range implies that's their limitation. So if you're talking about God as the infinite, unlimited entity, whatever your belief system is, how could you measure the immeasurable with a measure that has constraints and restrictions? Obviously you can't. So the point is not that we should know God. We can't know God. Yeah, we do have a perception, and it's good that we have that, but don't go beyond that. Don't expect more than that. So, we take back the argument of the difference between the nafs and the ruh, is that since, if you can play on the commanding part of it, is that usually when we talk about nafs, which is the owned self, and we start in terms of how we operate those. We are all born with that nafs, and to use a more modern psychology term, that nafs will be more the equivalent of the ego and the id combined, perhaps in some ways, that we are so self-centered that we are born with the sense that we think that the whole world and perhaps the whole universe is spinning around our entity. That's how big this ego is. And the idea for social harmony, for family harmony, for compatibility, for harmony, is that the realization that the center of the universe is nowhere near where our ego operates. In other words, you think of yourself as being everything, and by implication that whatever the outer power is, the divine, the God, is nothing. So the idea here is to transfer that centrality of being, take it away from the self. You who think of yourself as everything, to become nothing, so that that which you have considered to be nothing can rightfully be everything, which is God. And I'm sure you probably saw me several times using my hand in my direction and your direction, subconsciously, of course. That's where the question of the inner journey comes in. Because we have developed the outer senses, the sense of smell and touch and all that, because we have developed only those ones, then when we try to understand God, or for that matter any metaphysical phenomena, we use our outer senses. And I just explained to you that the outer senses have limitations. So what is the option? The option is that we have to reverse that. Instead of going that way, we have to go this way, look for it within. Now, before we can go to the within, we have to understand that in Islamic thought, in addition to the 5 outer senses, we also have 5 inner senses. In other words, our human body, our skin is not the boundary of anything that you can call me and you. In other words, there is an infinity that starts at the farthest horizons of afaq, and then when it goes to the anfus, which is within, that's a continuum, that there is no boundary between the inner and the outer. So if you have to logically accept an inner and an outer, and you have equipped yourself to understand the outer with the outer senses, then it's equally applicable that you should use the inner senses for within. And the inner senses, just to give you a list, is first one is called the common sense. And the common sense is when we move to the level where the commonality of our senses with our other animals and beings. Like if you hear the pain of a wailing or a howling animal, dog, you know they are in pain. You don't have to be a dog to know that a dog is in pain. That's your common sense. From there we go to a level of what we call khayal, or in Arabic khayal, which is the imagination. Now this imagination is not your sense of fantasy and daydreaming. No, not that one. The word is the same, but the application is that khayal is a sense that when you try to understand, for instance, when I'm talking here, I know you're all looking at me, but behind the camera of your eyes, there are images that are being created. You relate what I say to things you have heard before. Or maybe images of other things, like you saw an accident down the street before coming here. So those images are still playing. And that helps you understand things. So when we try to understand things, we need the sense of imagination to create the image for better comprehension. The next inner sense is called the wahm, or the awe, which is a kind of like fear, but being basically on the edge of an abyss between an understanding and not understanding. And you oscillate back and forth until you get a sense of certainty. And then the fourth one is called the fikr zikr, and these are used in pairs, in the sense that thinking alone is not enough, but thinking consciously. In other words, when you think as remembering something, but then you operate within that. So it is both fikr, to think, and zikr. And zikr is often referred to as an utterance, but it's not necessarily an utterance. It is the consciousness of being involved with a thought. In other words, the thought is not a dormant thought. It's an active and interactive thought. So that's the fourth one. And the last one is aql, which is translated as the intellect. But it's not necessarily the intellectual power we have. It is not the power of the intellect, but rather the sense of the intellect, which matches. Now we have 5 inner and 5 outer senses. Now, if you compare the East and the West in the global sense, what the East suffers from is that the Eastern world is copying everything from a Western culture, from a Western civilization. At the civilizational level, the only civilization that matters is Western civilization. Whether you call it Christian, Western, European, it doesn't matter. The standard by which we live at the civilizational level is Western. Okay? Even if you're in the East. And the problem with the Western civilization is that it was built on external senses only. In the age of Enlightenment. Remember the rebellion against the theocracies and Galileo and Copernicus and all those contradictions that were observed then. So because Western culture, civilization is developed and built on the outer senses, there is no mention of inner senses. The closest they come is the common sense, which is only an expression, not a recognized sense. And it's because of that no matter how wealthy, how powerful, how technologically advanced the West had become, the missing part is stated by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. The pursuit of happiness that everyone seeks, but nobody attains, is because they are trying to fly with one wing, the outer senses. The other wing is missing. If we can somehow marry the Eastern culture riches, which unfortunately even the Easterners have forgotten. So we have to enlighten our souls in the treasures of our civilization, which is in the past, and marry that with the Western civilization. The world will probably be a better place, or at least I'm thinking so optimistically. Let me go to this concept of the relevance of the inner. I told you earlier that there is no boundary between the inner and the outer. It's just a matter of relativity. But this is not just something I'm advocating. We have a saying of the Prophet, which if I can read, I probably mumble on the hadith, since I generally don't like hadith. Will blame Mr. Wasiq for that part of it. Here it says, "La tasani ardi wa la samai walakin yasani qalba abd mu'min." I don't fit in the heavens and on earth, but I do have a place in the heart of a believer. Who's talking? It's God talking through the Prophet, and therefore so it's not that much of a hadith. We would call this a hadith Qudsi, when it is God's God's concept with the Prophet's words. Those are called a hadith. When it's God's word and God's thought, and that's of course the Quran. So the reference is that it's only in the heart of a believer. What is a heart? It's not the organ that pumps blood. A heart is the core of your being. If you use the word core in in Latin, how do you spell core in Latin? C-O-R. Yeah, just take the E out, and that's the Latin. Core is the inner. Yes, we do point in this direction, but it's not necessarily the heart. And where you are, it's kind of difficult to pinpoint. You look in the mirror every morning, every evening, and you point out and you think it's you, right? What part of you, you have no idea. Because it's not a place. If you remember the poem I read you last week, I used the word placelessness. It's not in the Webster dictionary, but we can coin for free, right? So that placelessness is just that concept. That there is an inner more as a direction rather than as an exact point of reference. So don't look for the GPS there. Okay, that's not going to take you there unless you are using a special GPS, which would be what I guess we could call it the spiritual global positioning, something like that. Now, when you're headed in that inner direction, then you have to make sure that this is not a journey within you for the survival, because that's in the physical, but rather for the spiritual, where you discover yourself. And when you go in the inner, that connects back with what I used earlier, the word nafs, which is within you. So in and within are similar prepositions. So what is that? That the ego you're born with is generally referred to as the nafs ammara, which uses the amara. And that also shows that it's the commanding self, the commanding soul, the commanding ego. But the important part here is that the command is no longer your command. It is the ego commanding you to do things for it. You are the horse, and your soul, your ego is riding on your shoulders. Your ego is directing you to things it takes pleasure from. Whether it's right or wrong, that's a different story. You know, if you see a nice looking car with the keys in the ignition and the door is open, there might be some of those propensities that say, well, jump in and drive away, right? Because you don't ask the right and the wrong. The right and the wrong is here in the head. The nafs says, enjoy it, go for a ride. It uses the Nike slogan, just do it. No responsibility, right? So we start with that. And then if you have a sense of awareness, you have gone through a training, that the Sufis have their own traditions, the Western has their own therapeutic practices and all that, then you move on from the nafs ammara to the nafs lawama, and lawama is referred to as the blaming soul. And in the blaming, you have just acknowledged that there's something riding on your shoulders, that something is commanding you, directing you, the right way or the wrong and all that. And so what are you supposed to do? The Arabic word lawama refers to blaming, but it actually is reference to a responsibility, that you become aware and say, aha, the car does not belong to me. Okay? And you blame it on whatever you want to blame it, but you don't do the thing. So this is perhaps your first stage of graduation in the self-actualization, that you have not allowed the negative propensity to ride on your shoulders and direct you in every way. And you say, no, wait a minute, I am in charge. I take responsibility. I do the right thing. From lawama, you move on to the next level, which is called the mutma'inna. And at this point, you have realized the first two stages, and you say, aha, now I know what it's all about. And you sit back, and you relax, and you contemplate. Now, your actions have not emanated from your desires, but from sensing yourself, feeling yourself as part of the totality of existence. You look for harmony. Now you think you don't want anybody else to drive your car away, so you don't drive their car away either, right? Because you consider what's good for you is good for others, and vice versa. And we have these golden rules in almost every tradition. And then when you rise above that, you go to the two levels of Radiya and Mardiya. In the Radiya, which is the fourth stage, you say, okay, now I know better. I graduated from the first, the second, the third stage. At this stage, I'm going to do whatever is pleasing to the divine. Okay? You want to do what is pleasing to the divine. And sometimes even, perhaps, if it's not pleasing to you. Like getting up early in the morning to pray, boy, we're so sleepy and the bed is warm, but it's so cold out there. Right? So logically, it's the wrong thing to do. But you want to please God, so you displease yourself in order to please God. That is the Radhiya level. The fifth level, which is the highest level, if you reach that level of self-actualization, is that between that which pleases God and that which pleases you, there is no distinction. You do things because it pleases God, but it at the same time pleases you. So the distinction is gone. The distinction between what? Between that which you want and that which God wants, and therefore you and God have become one. That's the level of Tawheed. So you have made it. So if you go through these steps of self-actualization in the greater context of the harmony I was talking about, the world would be rosy, not in terms of the life expectancy of the rose, but the beauty of its petals, I guess. This last segment that I discussed was based on the Surah Al-Fajr, I think the very end of it, ayahs 27 to 30. Ya ayyuhan nafsul mutma'inna irji'i ila rabbika radiyatan mardiyah fadkhuli fi ibadi wadkhuli jannati. So we'll leave the Jannat part of it for a different discussion. But what is critical is that the Quran uses the word mutma'inna and not the word yaqeen when it comes to understanding. And the reason this is important is that yaqeen or certainty is here. It's part of your rational power. You have to be convinced. Someone has to reason with you. Someone has to explain to you. Someone has to give you the evidence. Once you're convinced, you have the yaqeen, you have the certainty. But note that the Quran didn't say, Ya ayyuhan nafsul yaqeen. It said, Ya ayyuhan nafsul mutma'inna. And the mutma'inna is different in the sense that it is a reference to the inner peace, which is what the whole lecture is about. You have itminan, or you have the inner peace when whatever your outer and inner senses, whatever information it gives you, the feedback and all that, when it registers within, you accept it. Not necessarily because you understand it. Because remember, Quran said, we have not given you the ability to detect, to understand. In actuality, Iman, and I'm not referring to one of our audience here, faith is not based on understanding. Okay? It's based on the inner peace when you accept it at a certain point. You say, I feel comfortable with this. It might be right, it might be wrong. But at this point, I don't care if it's right or if it's wrong. I accept it. Now, that creates a problem too. And I know there are some hands just beginning to go up, but before that happens, let me answer it in this sense that if you were talking about in terms of knowing God, certainty is the rarest of privileges. It's an impossibility. We talked about the logic of measuring the immeasurable with the limited senses we have. That's one argument. But the other thing is that when you have faith, in spite of the fact that it's good to have faith, be forewarned that it's a bad thing. It's a bad teacher. Because It makes you lazy because you stop thinking, because you stop searching. And so you're not thanking God for the greatest gift God has given you, the power of thinking. So it's good to have Iman, but don't stop there. The best teacher you have is a very healthy, skeptical thinking, skepticism. Always question things. Even if it's out of rebellion, even if it makes you feel good like God doesn't exist, fine. If it keeps you awake at night, then there's no greater worship than trying to answer that question, than standing on your prayer rug and going over 55 miles an hour in your sujood and ruku and all that. So, therefore, there is what is called that skepticism would be zan in Arabic, or zunun for plural. So zunun mutarakama, which is a perpetual intuitive suspicion. We wouldn't use the word itching. We wouldn't use the word bothering. We would use the word of internal dialoguing. It's that which talks with you from within you. You don't have an audience. You are the speaker. You are the responder. You are the audience. You are engaging yourself. And once you get to that, you hear an echo. Who do you think is talking? That's the divine. So God, just like we said earlier, Shaitan doesn't have to be a person. Neither does God have a personality. God is not a person because persons have limitations and God does not. If God is omnipresent, right? Omnipotent and all the other attributes we attribute to God, therefore God is a positive propensity. It's the energy that is empowering the entire universe. And that entire universe, I think, deserves a word that's perhaps better than just the word God. I mean, I like the word God, but I don't like it. And here's why. Because the word God was created several thousand years back when the understanding of humanity was so preliminary that they had to assume things, objects, as God. They objectified God. The God of fire, the God of rain, etc., etc. Natural disaster, hurricanes, mudslides, these were God powers. And that mindset has remained with us. We have not evolved to take God or the divine power to a level higher than that, that is deserving of our understanding. We have advanced in science and technology, we can go to the moon, but we still operate with that obsolete interpretation of what God ought to be. And that will take me back to a reflection, and I'm going to a quatrain of one of my great compatriots from Herat, Afghanistan, Khaja Abdullah Ansari, and I will read this in the original, and if you don't understand it, you don't understand it. But it is in a way similar to the reflection of the poem I started with, and we will use that for a conclusion. So Ansari writes, Ya Rab, dil pak u jan agaham de, ah shab u girye sahargaham de, dar rah khud awal z khudam be khud kon, be khud ch shudam z khud be khud rahem de. And my reflections, which is only coincidentally similar, which was where we started, I escape from myself to find thee, only to realize that you have always been within me and with me. The boldness of thought cannot contain thy magnificence, yet you always remain in my thoughts. As I think in thee, I think with thee. In me, you become the thought continuously thinking itself. You are indeed the very thought I am. As I am, therefore I think. I think thee. Thank you. So questions from last week and this week? If you remember what we talked about, so long as you don't expect good answers, I will entertain a few.
We can take one or two more questions if you have.
Yeah, there is a small question here.
You just read, you repeat it several times, which ones? Or is it my imagination?
The one from Ansari or my own? No, it's the word. It's not. It's not hamd. Yeah. Well, let me try a translation. It says, "O divine power, give me a cleansed heart and an aware self. Give me the awe, the sigh of the night, and the tears of the morning. And in your path, allow me first to lose myself. And when that happens, then let me find you through me." That was a spontaneous translation. I hope I did some justice to it. Yeah. Yes?
Hold on. Thanks a lot for coming. First of all, I wanted to say, so the levels of spirituality you mentioned, how do you know, like, is there any hints or signs that you know you're heading towards the next level? Like, how do you identify what stage are you on and where are you? Because I know it's either shrinking or increasing growth. It's not going to stop. So, what are some clues, I guess, hints you could probably tell us or just inform us?
Well, these are not the levels of spirituality. This is the levels of elevating from the states of the ego.
Yeah.
The levels of spirituality is a long story that I spent months on teaching at Pacifica. But to give you is this a long answer or a short answer to a long question? Is that if you are aware of the stages in which you are, then you're not in any stage. Because you're paying attention to the form. You have to lose yourself so much that you don't know where you are. The important thing in this path is to keep going. Don't look at the odometer to see how many kilometers you have traveled. It's the direction you go to, which is the jihad. And that's what we do in prayers. When you pray, you face which direction? Qibla means what? No, it means that which is before you, from the word qabl. Okay? So follow that which is before you and keep going and don't ask. You don't have to arrive. What's important is that you make sure that you are moving. That's what matters. Not the arrival. Because that would require certainty and you can't get certainty. So the going is more important than trying to do the, what do they do, kind of miles, coupons the airlines give that? Frequent. Yeah, don't worry about the frequent miles. Those are not relevant. Okay, other questions?
One last question, yes, and then we'll
Yes.
Just it's similar question, but just related. What are there Quranic origins to these different levels of believing yourself to be ego? I'm just wondering what the source is of this thing has.
The sources, I read you the ayah in the Quran, Surah Fajr. I think it is Surah 89, verses 27 to 30, which lays out the basics. However, Islam is not just in the Quran, but in the very splendid traditions that developed at a time before Eurocentrism claimed the father of psychology, the father of this and the father of other things. The fathers used to be over on that side of the world. And so the Islamic tradition, which is basically divided into tasawwuf, which is the self-purification, and irfan, which is the self-illumination or the enlightenment of the soul. In that, they developed various methodologies, and I mentioned only the five selves here. That is for the self-actualization. There are also nafs nataqa, for instance, the bickering one within you. There are other ways which, before there was Jung and before there was Sigmund Freud and all these great European psychologists, the Muslims did all that work. And they used their methodology would be what was called riyaza, which is both self-actualization and therapeutical self-actualization that the Sufis practiced. So one is, the Sufism is the practical part to purify the self, and Irfan is the spiritual intellectual part to make yourself knowledgeable about the path. So they are deeply rooted in the Islamic mystical tradition. And if you look at it in reality, the spiritual Islam was born before the dogmatic Islam. Remember where the Prophet was going? To the dark cave. For what? So long before there was the revelation of the Quran, the Prophet was doing the meditation already. He was already abandoning the worldly matters to others. He was already going to the dark cave so he could see the light. And the great ones, whether it's Siddhartha Buddha, who went to the jungle, Moses, who went to Sinai, Jesus, who went to Kashmir, and so on and so forth, the Prophet went to a dark cave to be enlightened. So these contradictions themselves are not only just symbolic, but that shows that Islam was originated as a spiritual tradition, and then the scriptures were revealed.
Thank you so much.